The church bell tolled, and with each echo, the life I once knew seemed to fold further into silence. My wife Kimberly's funeral was not just the end of a love story. It was the beginning of a reckoning I had never imagined. As I stood among mourners, their faces blurred by grief and expectation, I felt the weight of eyes not only mourning her but measuring me. They did not know what I carried in silence. They did not know that in the days to come, my children would smile at me with tenderness sharpened into strategy, and one of them would tell me to start packing because our house, had already been sold. What they could not guess was that long before those words left her lips, I had quietly prepared myself. Kimberly had seen the predators coming. She had armed me in ways they would never suspect. And while my daughters believed I would crumble under grief, I was already holding a secret that would rewrite the terms of their betrayal. People called the funeral dignified. I noticed faces. My daughters Kate and Emma, hands clenched. Jason, a shadow at the pews. Isabel, Kate's child, seemed stunned into silence, eyes rimmed with a blunt fury. Rio, Emma's son, held his throat as though he were swallowing a question. If you're watching this right now, hit that like button and subscribe. I'd also love to know, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments, and while you're there, tell me your first reaction to this story. Kimberly and I had built a life that did not ask for applause. We owned a house on a quiet cul-de-sac in Memphis, a house that smelled of coffee and old books, of my wife's hands on the piano. We also kept our private things private. That was Kimberly's rule. Numbers and names should be like a locked drawer, only opened when necessary. After the last hymn, the family gathered at the house. They chose Kimberly's study, like wolves at a den. My daughters arrived smiling, the kind of smile that rehearses sympathy in the mirror. Kate had a folder. Emma had a proposal. They sat opposite me and played their part. Concerned daughters offering a kind solution to a father too old to manage a mansion. I've been talking to people, Dad, Kate said. She used the soft managerial tone that had carried her through custody court and corporate disputes. We can renovate and make passive income. Airbnb. It's modern. You won't have to worry about upkeep. You can't keep a house like this alone, Emma said. It's dangerous. We can find you an apartment. Her words were clinical. Her smile practice. Jason looked at me and then at the floor. He didn't argue. He never had, not since the beatings of adolescence softened into apathy. He whispered later, his voice a small betrayal. Dad, I can help. I don't want a fight. The word predator had floated between Kimberly and me. She had warned me of vultures who eat the fruit and leave the branches. The funeral had not cooled appetites. It had sharpened them. They spoke of care and safety, of what's practical. But their practicality was raw accounting. A conversion of a life into a ledger. When Emma said, "You're an old black man with a house that doesn't fit the stereotypes. You're at a disadvantage," something cold snapped in me. Condescension wrapped as concern is betrayal made incurable. That night I woke and went to Kimberly's study, as if drawn by a compass only she could see. I opened drawers she used to keep her pens in and found a velvet pouch beneath a stack of envelopes. A flash drive lying within had 2 words stitched into my memory. Kim's secret. I did not need to plug it in to feel the weight. I could sense Kimberly's breath across the years. Still, I plugged it in. On the screen were deeds to a villa in Reykjavik, bank statements, and a substantial life insurance policy. Documents established well before this grief. A trust named Isabel and Rio as future beneficiaries. Kimberly's handwriting closed the packet with a directive. When predators come, do not be surprised. Use this. Guard the children. After 40 years, Kimberly shocked me with one last maneuver. Not an escape plan but a stronghold. I traced her looping handwriting with my thumb on the screen, each phrase a blueprint. Images of Isabel and Rio, young, hungry for truth, rose in my mind. If Kimberly had prepared a fortress, then I would learn its gates and guard them with the stubbornness of a man who knew how to stand his ground. I sat there late into the night, the glow of the monitor painting Kimberly's study in cold blues, thinking of vultures and legacies, counting the years. I slept with schematics quietly in my head. The funeral had been a public ceremony. Kimberly's plan was a private revolution. Tomorrow my children would return with smiles. I had found my answer in velvet and bites. I had already packed, though they did not know it then. The household hummed, but beneath it a current moved, a plan Kimberly set in motion for reasons both tender and tactical. For the first time since her illness began, I felt a strange relief. Grief had a map. They asked for Kimberly's study again, as if repeating a ceremony might change the script. Morning light slanted across her sheet music while Kate smoothed the folder corners with habitual precision. Emma sat opposite, calm in looks and urgent in intent. Jason lingered by the doorway, shoulders carrying the weight of an indecision he could not shake. "They'll make it work," Kate began, opening her presentation. "Convert upstairs to short-term rentals. Passive income." Charts gleamed on her pages. "We have someone ready to manage renovations and bookings. It's safe, profitable." Emma added, "You could move to a one-level apartment. No stairs, no maintenance. We'll take care of you." Their language was clinical. Care had been repackaged as calculus. "We can set up a trust," Kate said, "and you won't even have to worry about taxes." Trust, the word, felt like an accusation against Kimberly's own secret trust documented on the flash drive. I listened without anger. I listened like an officer taking statements, every word catalogued. "Who is the investor?" I asked. Kate handed me a sheet. "A local investor, a firm I'd never heard of. He's reputable," she said. "He works with the neighborhood association." Emma's argument took a harder edge when she said, "You don't understand how the world is set up, Dad. Banks' expectations. Your age and color matter in ways you don't want to feel." That last phrase was offered like a coat, meant to warm but too thin. There was an undercurrent to their tenderness, an attempt to convert grief into liquidity. Jason wanted peace. "Dad, we're trying to do what's best," he said, avoiding my eyes. His unwillingness to pit himself against his sisters was a kind of betrayal I recognized. Fear dressed as filial duty. He meant to keep the family whole, even as the family splintered. I recorded each meeting. I dated pages with exact phrases they used, who urged what, and the names of professionals they recommended. Bar Murphy Ryan advised the same. Document, verify, and do not sign. Murphy reminded me that institutional procedures, medical reviews, trust drafts, provide plausible cover for coercive moves. One afternoon, Dr. Harlow came by. Her office smelled of lavender. She was soft and practiced. She ran a brief cognitive screening. I answered her questions without fanfare. Passing offered them comfort. It did nothing to change their momentum. Kate smiled as if the world had tilted back to their favor. Emma called it a precaution. But precautions accumulate. A single, reasonable suggestion, an assessment, a consultant, a temporary trust, could become a paper trail that altered control. I had spent decades reading patterns. Criminals build narratives with small truths until the story fits their ends. This felt the same. Isabel and Rio sat in the corner. Teenagers folded by grief and confusion. Isabel's jaw tightened when Kate described renovations. Rio's forehead creased when Emma invoked banks. Their silence weighed like an accusation on their mothers. I watched the children and realized the scheme could fracture more than property. It could hollow the family. That thought sharpened my resolve. I would gather evidence and allies. I would make sure that any attempt to convert memory into money met legal rigor. Murphy proposed a slow play, verify the title, ensure documents were authentic, and prepare a legal posture rather than a public spectacle. If they attempt anything, he said, you respond with law, not anger. His caution steadied me. We would not be hasty. We would be precise. The daughter's arsenal was plausible. Consultants, doctors, well-meaning professionals. So their moves smelled of legitimacy. But legitimacy can be weaponized. Their polite language and tidy charts were a kind of social armor. They banked on the idea that grief would muddle judgment and speed would obscure motive. When Kate pushed for a preliminary signature, I said no. I don't sign anything today, I told them. Their faces hardened. We're trying to help, they said, simultaneously pleading and commanding. Their insistence carried the arrogance of someone who expects obedience. That night I walked the house and cataloged memories. Kimberly's handwriting was a map I could follow. The flash drive sat in the lockbox. Murphy would comb through the files. For now I preserved silence like a defense. As the meeting's residue settled, I realized one truth. The family meeting had been the opening move. The investor page, the doctor's card, the talk of a trust, these were probes. They wanted a reaction. Their confidence suggested they expected my grief to break into compliance. They were wrong. Kimberly had not simply planned escape. She had planned for endurance. And endurance, I decided, would be methodical. The smiles contained a strategy. Over the following week, Kate and Emma shifted from concern to incremental pressure, each visit delivering a new layer. A proposed power of attorney, a doctor's recommendation, a counselor's card slipped into conversation. They packaged intention as care. "We can set up a trust," Kate said in a voice trained for negotiation. "Convert upstairs into short-term rentals. Passive income. It's practical." Emma added, "Move to a single-level apartment. No stairs, no chores." The words were soft but precise. Their tenderness carried a ledger's logic. They proposed a physician's evaluation, just to be safe. "A neutral party," Emma said. "It won't change anything unless a professional says so." The invitation masked an obvious threat. A medical opinion could be wielded to question capacity. Their circle of allies, an estate consultant, a financial acquaintance, a suggested physician, made the plan feel inevitable. Jason wanted peace. "Dad, we're trying to do what's best," he said, avoiding my eyes. His unwillingness to pit himself against his sisters was a kind of betrayal I recognized. Fear dressed as filial duty. He meant to keep the family whole, even as the family splintered. I recorded each meeting. I dated pages with exact phrases they used, who urged what, and the names of professionals they recommended. Bar Murphy Ryan advised the same. Document, verify, and do not sign. Murphy reminded me that institutional procedures, medical reviews, trust drafts, provide plausible cover for coercive moves. One afternoon, Dr. Harlow came by. Her office smelled of lavender. She was soft and practiced. She ran a brief cognitive screening. I answered her questions without fanfare. Passing offered them comfort. It did nothing to change their momentum. Kate smiled as if the world had tilted back to their favor. Emma called it a precaution. But precautions accumulate. A single, reasonable suggestion, an assessment, a consultant, a temporary trust, could become a paper trail that altered control. I had spent decades reading patterns. Criminals build narratives with small truths until the story fits their ends. This felt the same. Isabel and Rio watched from the hallway, young eyes wide with a dawning comprehension. Isabel clutched a pamphlet about scholarships, her knuckles white. Rio's jaw worked as Kate described efficiency and market value in ways that made his face go hard. They were learning adult calculations in the worst classroom. Grief. Seeing them there made my resolve colder. I could not allow their inheritance of lies. I imagined them older, facing a world where memory had been sold for short-term profit. Kimberly would have been furious and meticulous. She had given me instructions precisely to prevent this. That thought quickened my steps. I called Murphy, and we drafted a preliminary cease and desist ready to issue the moment anyone filed for transfer. Preparation, not panic, would be our shield. Their tactics had a rhythm, softening language in front of outsiders, a harder edge in private. I watched as they cultivated plausible deniability through recommended professionals. Their weapon was normalcy, a doctor's note, a consultant's suggestion, a signature on a form. It could all seem, to anyone watching, practical. I refused to be baited. I began to set traps of my own, records, witnesses, legal counsel. I would not meet their pressure with fury but with evidence. Justice, after 40 years of serving, had taught me that patience and proof undo coercion. Murphy prepared preliminary notices and advised me to gather proof of my financial independence and mental soundness. Retirement statements, commendations, bank records, colleagues who could attest to my clarity. He told me to document every conversation and to avoid any signing without his review. That week ended with me sitting at Kimberly's kitchen table, the house quiet, the the city lights like a scatter of witnesses. I read her words one more time and felt a current of gratitude. She had not left me empty. She had prepared a defense, a map for a future that could be generous rather than consumed. Their pressure was relentless. Mine would be methodical. The flash drive seemed small and ordinary, but inside Kimberly had hidden an entire architecture. When I opened the files, the screen filled with deeds, ledgers, and a letter in her handwriting that commanded more attention than any lawyer's affidavit. Deeds showed a villa outside Reykjavik, a registry stamp, and property coordinates. Bank ledgers documented accounts established in an Icelandic bank, an education endowment, and transfer instructions. A life insurance policy named me as beneficiary. Its proceeds were directed toward a trust for Isabel and Rio. The trust itself was the key. Kimberly called it the Iceland Legacy Trust. The trust was irrevocable and professionally structured, with trustees and a named agent, Diego Amarin. Its clauses were exact: the villa to serve as sanctuary and education home for Isabel and Rio, funds to support scholarships and legal defense, the Memphis house to remain a conserved family homestead. Kimberly had written contingencies for cross-border legal disputes, language designed to frustrate opportunists. Her handwriting threaded through the packet. "Guard the children," she wrote. "Do not sign anything under pressure. Contact Diego. Use this to teach Isabel and Rio stewardship, not entitlement." The letter was both map and exhortation, tender, strategic, unyielding. I felt both betrayed and grateful. Betrayed that she had not told me sooner, grateful that she had anticipated predators in the guise of kin. The practical pieces leaped from the files: Diego's contact information, a Reykjavik number and an email, a trustee agreement that required professional sign-off in Reykjavik for significant changes, an account dedicated to educational expenses and internships, with figures sufficient to cover university abroad. The trust even specified an age, 30, before the Memphis homestead could be freely accessed by beneficiaries, a measure Kimberly wrote to ensure maturity. Diego's references described him as discreet, efficient, someone who handled property matters and educational placements. Kimberly had arranged for a Reykjavik trustee firm to hold accounts. The more I read, the clearer it became. She had prepared time and distance to blunt the impulse to monetize sorrow. I phoned Bar Murphy Ryan and read him the essentials. "Send me everything," he said. "We will not make rash moves, but we will make sure nothing shifts without authority." Murphy's voice carried the caution of the seasoned. Use the documents wisely, reveal when strategic. I wrestled with timing. Informing Isabel and Rio could empower them, but it also risked alerting others. The plan had to be deployed with precision. Kimberly's directive about Diego felt like a lifeline. She trusted him explicitly. If Kimberly had given me that thread, I would follow it. I made practical preparations. I copied files onto a secure drive, burned additional encrypted copies, and organized the paperwork for Murphy to review. I packed nothing dramatic, just a case with Kimberly's scarf and my coat, an acknowledgement that readiness sometimes speaks louder than action. That night I read Kimberly's words until the lamp grew dim. She had built a legal fortress in a place chosen for its stability and discretion. Iceland was not a whim. It was a deliberate selection for a jurisdiction that would complicate anyone hoping to seize assets quickly. The trustee structure, the irrevocable language, the professional oversight, they all pointed to a design meant to resist familial impatience. My thoughts turned to Isabel and Rio. They had been raised by their mother's public versions, but Kimberly had been their quiet benefactor. The trust's scholarship line proved it. She had sheltered their futures from the noise of adult arguments. I believed they deserved to know, to choose sanctuary and purpose over complicity. So I waited. Murphy would vet the documents, Diego would be contacted discreetly, and I would not act impulsively. Kimberly's plan was not an invitation to immediate flight but a measured scaffold. She wanted the grandchildren to be trained and to arrive ready to steward, not merely to inherit. As midnight neared, I placed the flash drive into a small lockbox and set the box beneath a stack of Kimberly's old sheet music. The gesture felt symbolic and practical. Kimberly had hidden a fortress in a drawer. I would guard it until the day came to reveal its gates. The house felt less like prey and more like a defended territory. I slept that night with a quiet focus. The existence of the trust had shifted the center of the struggle. Until now, the conflict had been local and immediate. Now it had transatlantic breadth. I would move patiently, but I would move. Kimberly had left us a map. It was my job to follow it without haste and without error. I carried Kimberly's secret like a compass, its needle pointing away from surrender. In the days after the discovery, the house changed. Rooms that had been neutral now felt like battlements, and ordinary objects, the teapot on the stove, the wicker chair beneath the window, took on the weight of decisions. Knowing the map Kimberly had left me, I moved in ways that were meticulous. Murphy advised caution. "You hold leverage now," he said, "but don't broadcast it. Let them make mistakes." He told me to secure the drive, make copies, catalog Kimberly's letters, and to begin the long, quiet work of paperwork. We filed initial notices with the county clerk to ensure records could not be altered without scrutiny. Murphy's hands were steady as he handled the documents. The law felt like an impartial ally. I drafted a plan. First, verify and authenticate every document on the flash drive. Second, preserve the Memphis property from any transfers. Third, discreetly contact Diego to arrange for counsel on the Iceland side. Fourth, prepare witnesses, neighbors, the family attorney, old colleagues who could testify to my capacity and Kimberly's intentions. The plan read like a manual because it had to. Legal structures demand precision, not outrage. My children continued their visits, their voices honeyed. Each time they left, I cataloged new subtleties. A phrase meant to coax, a promise of care, a mention of how simpler life expects fewer complications. Kate wore the expression of someone who had convinced herself of inevitability. Emma spoke of vulnerability as if it were a fact and not a weapon. Jason stood in the cracks. Isabel and Rio floated between adolescence and a newfound adultness. Isabel stared at old photographs with a suspicion that had no gentle name. Rio, more reserved, began to ask questions about money and scholarship receipts and who had truly paid for their last semester. Truth, in small doses, was eroding the mother's narrative. As I moved through these days, memories of Kimberly washed over me. Her hands at the kitchen sink, the way she'd shut a drawer and smile when she'd hidden something for later. She had been deliberate with affection and ruthless with protection. I remembered the phrase she'd used often, "Don't let convenience rename courage." The secrecy weighed upon me like a folded map. There were nights when I sat in Kimberly's study and read her notes aloud to myself, shaping strategies from her voice. She had left contact names: Diego, trustees, and a Reykjavik law firm. Diego, in particular, had a clarity about him in Kimberly's notes. Trusted, decisive, discreet. It gave me solace that she had not cobbled this together alone. One morning I wrote a letter to Isabel and Rio, brief and careful. I did not reveal everything. I did not promise escape. I wrote about stewardship, about how their grandparents had taught them to value continuity over consumption. I placed the letter where Kimberly had once left notes, a tucked corner of her piano bench. I wanted them to find it by chance, to take the first step toward understanding without spectacle. My hope was that curiosity would lead them to ask questions rather than accept easy answers. I also called Diego. The call connected me to a measured voice with a Portuguese lilt and a patience that matched Kimberly's handwriting. Diego did not ask many questions. He asked the right ones. "Your wife prepared carefully," he said. "We need to coordinate quietly. Documents must be validated." He recommended the Reykjavik trustees and said he would await our formal introduction. Every move felt like a chess play. I began to gather corroborative evidence of my competence. My federal retirement statements, old commendations, bank statements showing financial independence. Murphy said about drafting letters that would call out any improper attempts at transfer. Preparation, not panic, felt like resistance. The grief remained raw. The house a hollow where Kimberly's humming once resided. But the knowledge that she had prepared this fortress steadied me. I began to see the future as a sequence of necessary acts. Evidence, verification, protection, and eventual revelation. Done on our terms. As the days progressed, a certain clarity replaced panic. My life had been given to service and to love. Kimberly had prepared one last act of service for our grandchildren. I could not allow that to be desecrated by opportunists cloaked in familial concern. On an evening when rain scraped the windows, I closed the study and placed Kimberly's notes back in my pocket. I walked the house slowly, as if counting rooms might ordain them safe. The flash drive was in the lockbox beneath the music sheets. Outside, the neighborhood hummed with ordinary life. Inside, I felt the heavy architecture of the future settle into place. I had a map, lawyers, and a patient resolve. The next moves would be deliberate, and they would be mine always. Kate and Emma had fastened their plan into legal language. They hired an attorney whose business cards smelled of new ink. The letter was politely formal, a request for a family conference to discuss care options, and an offer to assist in estate management. It read like concern, but every officer in me learned to read phrasing. Phrasing is motive's footprint. That afternoon they sent additional paperwork, a proposed power of attorney and a draft medical evaluation request. Kate called it prudence. Emma called it due diligence. Jason grumbled he wished they had told him sooner. He wanted peace, and peace meant signing papers that would move the house like a tide. I carried the envelope to Bar Murphy Ryan and sat with him across his oak desk. Bar read their letter twice, then placed my title deed on the blotter. They can request, he said, but they cannot take without cause. We will not be bullied by polite words. Bar verified the deed chain, called registry offices, and confirmed every signature legitimate. This property, he said, tapping the paper, is in your name. He also warned of hazards, a guardianship petition, an urgent medical evaluation, a judge persuaded by the idea of a frail man in a house too big for him. They're building a paper case, Bar said. We need to show the paper trail that counters them. Pension records, colleagues who will attest to your clarity, receipts proving mortgage payments, neighbors willing to testify. We'll compile it and preempt their moves. We began an inventory. My federal pension statements, letters from retired captains, stacks of receipts. These were not numbers. They were testimony. Bar wanted the world to see I had managed complex finances for years and could sign checks without assistance. The proof would be legal armor. Meanwhile, Kate and Emma accelerated. They spoke to the neighborhood association, mentioned safety concerns, and suggested an inspector. Emma called the bank to ask about holding funds until a trust is established. Tactics multiplied. They intended to smother truth with procedure. They also softened their approach to the grandchildren. Isabel arrived with a bouquet and a face that looked younger than the fury I'd seen at the funeral. Dad, she whispered. This will be best. Rio's questions were sharper now, about terms and tuition, his eyes like small ledgers. Their worry was leveraged into doubt about me. I scheduled my own independent evaluation. One Bar recommended, a respected geriatric specialist with no family ties. I answered each test with the patience of a man practiced in forms. If medical narrative was their weapon, I would provide counterproof. Bar drafted a response to the daughter's attorney. He did not lash out. He filed a polite but firm notice. Any attempt to transfer, encumber, or litigate the property without my informed consent would be met with immediate legal challenge. The words formed a formal cordon around my rights. The daughter's attorney nudged back with insinuations. For the elder's safety, he wrote, it may be prudent to consider alternative housing. Bar, unbothered, pointed to other documents Kimberly had secured. The property had been paid off years before. Life insurance policies existed that funded a trust, and there were international arrangements Kimberly had quietly created to secure Isabel and Rio's education. He emphasized those facts in his reply, ensuring the record showed the mansion was not a brittle asset to be seized. At night I walked the mansion and listened to rooms remember. The halls kept decades like dust. Each echo felt like witness. Kimberly had arranged her pieces like a chess player anticipating a check. Now I was called to play. My career had taught me patience and evidence. Now I used both. Bar arranged for former precinct captains and neighbors to provide affidavits. Kimberly's longtime financial advisor drafted a letter tracing the origin of the education funds and confirming the property's paid-off status. We copied ledgers, receipts, and assembled a dossier. Bar warned me to avoid public outbursts. Social media turns family into spectacle. and to let law, not sentiment, set the terms. He notified the bank that any freeze would require a court order and recommended placing an encrypted copy of the flash drive in his firm's safe overnight. We also kept a discreet log of visitors and calls, not to spy, but to document attempts at pressure. Barr said readiness, not reaction, wins these fights, and I believed him. We would let the evidence speak. Haste would be our enemy. No theatrics, only proof today. The legal play had begun. It was long-form strategy. We would not rush to battle where the other side chose. We would build records, witnesses, and time. When they assumed grief would blur judgment, we would answer with clarity. Barr said, "They've opened a file. We will answer it with proof." The next move would be ours. Barr filed the formal notice, a crisp, ceremonial document that read like a command. Any attempts to transfer or encumber the property without Joe Smith's informed consent would be met immediately. He delivered it to the daughter's attorney and copied the county registry and the bank. The response was immediate, but not in court. It arrived in a flurry of phone calls and the sudden silence that follows a misstep. Kate and Emma's lawyer, a man whose confidence had smelled like certainty, called Barr and spoke in a tone that faltered for the first time. He asked for time to reassess and then withdrew from the aggressive posture his clients had promised him. The withdrawal was tacit acknowledgement. The file, once thin and procedural, had become too heavy with truth. Their retreat did not feel like mercy. It felt like calculation exposed. Kate sent a message that read like a PR draft. "We are reconsidering our approach for Dad's comfort," and signed it with the practiced warmth of a person scripting forgiveness. Emma called that evening and left a voice message filled with therapy words. "I'm working on myself." The words had the mutter of someone who'd been caught. The neighborhood stirred. Rumors coalesced into questions. The association pulled back from endorsing any inspector. A local blogger who had speculated about the mansion's future removed his piece with a brief note about awaiting facts. The social momentum that had favored the daughters evaporated when faced with legal paperwork and evidence. The court of public opinion cooled. Still, victory felt brittle. Barr warned that withdrawal was only temporary shelter. The daughters might regroup, refine their legal strategy, or find another attorney willing to fight. He said, "People will test borders and then test again. The first retreat means we defended the line, not that the war's over." I found small confirmations in unlikely places. A former partner from my precinct stopped by and handed me a typed letter describing my clarity and reliability in old cases. A neighbor who had once complained about a hedge offered a notarized statement about seeing me manage bills and property repairs. Even Jason, rigid with an apology he could not say, agreed to appear for a deposition if necessary. Slowly, the village of evidence gathered like flotsam into a raft. Isabel and Rio observed from a hesitant distance. Isabel hugged me after the news of the withdrawal. Rio read through messages and found old scholarship receipts hidden in Kimberly's files. He shoved them across the table like evidence in a mock trial. "Why didn't they tell us?" he asked, not looking up. The question landed between the daughters' claims and their own accountability. Legal victory had a quiet, oddly domestic flavor. Barr and I celebrated by ticking off boxes on a list, a performance that, to an outsider, might look like paperwork. We held depositions, notarized declarations, and filed an affidavit with the county clerk affirming that any transfer would be contested. The motion was not theatrical. It was a set of precise movements that made it harder for opportunism to operate in the open. But the daughter's retreat prompted other moves. Kate removed photographs from the living room, deliberately I thought, and Emma arranged meetings with a therapist, then posted a public announcement about reconciliation and growth. The PR was swift and glossy. Regret was trending. They sought to recast themselves as repentant, to soften the lines the law had drawn. Reconciliation is a language with many dialects. Sometimes it means repair. Other times it is a tactic. Apologize loudly, then resume the plan with subtler methods. I knew this. Kimberly had known it too. That was why she had built the trust and set distance, to ensure apology alone could not open a legal door. The small victory allowed me space to breathe, but not to lower my guard. Barr and I continued to prepare. More affidavits, an expanded dossier, the beginnings of a conservation trust draft to place the Memphis house into. The idea was simple. Turn the house from a marketable asset into a preserved homestead tied to Isabel and Rio's maturity. If the daughters sought liquidity, they would find a legal structure designed to resist impulsive sale. Night brought me to Kimberly's piano bench. I touched the place where she left notes and thought of her hand guiding mine through maps of contingencies. The house felt a shade safer, the air less charged. Still, I slept with a plan. The law had given us a reprieve, but not absolution. We would take the time the victory bought and make it permanent, not by anger, but by discipline and foresight. We would make patience our final weapon. They returned the next day with soft words and practiced patience. Kate wore a jacket with a corporate pin she used as armor. Emma had a therapist's card in her purse like a talisman. They stepped into the foyer expecting persuasion to be enough. Instead, they found movers, a rented truck, and the deliberate motions of packing. I hired movers through a discreet service. The driver looked at the load list, then at me, and nodded. We box, we store, no drama, he said. The boxes moved fast. Trophies, photo albums, a violin in its soft case, yellowed certificates from school plays. I did not throw anything away. I cataloged. Each box received a name tag. Isabel's school projects, Kate's old awards, Emma's community service plaques. I had no interest in erasing memory. I had a duty to curtail misuse. When Kate saw her high school banner going into a labeled box, she stopped like a struck bird. "Dad," she said, voice thin. "What are you doing?" Her astonishment tasted less like confusion and more like the annoyance of a plan encountering a problem. Emma walked around the piled boxes as if inspecting a scene. "You can't," she began, then faltered. The sight of their childhood paraphernalia packed under official tape felt like a humiliation they had not anticipated. I told them plainly, "This house is not yours to divide." The words landed with the finality of a slammed file drawer. I offered them access, supervised with receipts, not confiscation. I wanted to avoid spite. I wanted to reset boundaries. The boxes were a physical statement. If they could not be trusted with the past, they would not be trusted with its selling. Neighbors watched. Mrs. Cartwright from next door stood in her garden and watched me box up a frame that had held the family on our porch swing. Her eyes were kind but alert. Word spread slowly. Gossip walked the neighborhood like a cautious cat. I expected anger, but saw instead a strange, brittle silence from my daughter's inner circle. That evening, Kate sent a lawyer's letter that pushed for immediate access to family photographs and heirlooms. The letter read polite but demanded transparency. Barr answered with the same calm he offered in court. "We will allow supervised access and a detailed inventory." Litigation would not help them reclaim motive. Isabel stopped me after the movers left, her hands sticky from dust. "Why did you box their things?" she asked. Her voice had a mixture of hurt and a new steadiness. "Because you and Rio deserve a home, not to be sold off," I told her. She looked at the boxes and then at me as if assessing whether truth could be softened by intention. "We won't let them rewrite our history," she said. Rio nodded beside her, quieter, but his eyes were fierce. The action changed the dynamic. It drew lines not just in the house but in loyalties. Friends of Kate called hurt. "He humiliated us," one said. But others, those who had known Kimberly's quiet generosity, expressed relief. "She would have done the same," Mrs. Cartwright muttered, referencing a woman who planned in secrecy for love's long arc. The boxes sat in a rented storage unit, each labeled and recorded. I left a set of receipts with Barr, copies filed in the trust folder. The move had been symbolic, but symbols are law-adjacent. They make intentions visible. Over the next days, Kate and Emma tried softer tactics. Guilt, pleading, and an effort to draw Jason back into coalition. I recited Kimberly's lines about predators and watched their faces. The daughters shifted their tone in public. Apologies, attempts at reconciliation, offers of help. Behind closed doors, they still pressed for meetings and policies that made selling easier. The public persona softened. The private operation continued. There is an odd honesty in dividing material things. You either see what matters or you reveal what you want. I wanted to protect a legacy rather than liquidate it. Each labeled box was a promise that history would be preserved for Isabel and Rio. Each receipt was a record that I would not be coerced. On nights when boxes lined the living room like a new decor, I would sit with Kimberly's notes and plan. I considered the Conservation Trust, the international arrangements, and the slow work of making legality match morality. I had upset my daughter's plan, but I had also forced them into choices they would have to own. The moving truck had done more than ferry objects. It had made a statement that reverberated through our family. We had turned protection into action. One afternoon, while cataloging boxes and filing documents, Isabel found a folder tucked behind a stack of Kimberly's old planners. Inside were letters from universities, scholarship confirmations, and checks issued by K.M. Smith, Kimberly's initials, paying for terms and housing. Rio uncovered bank transfer statements that listed payments labeled Education Endowment. The receipts did not whisper, they spoke clearly. Kimberly and I had paid for their schooling. Isabel's face moved through confusion to something fiercer, as if a dark lens had been stripped away. "Why?" she began, then stopped, the sentence cracking. Rio read a ledger aloud. The words were blunt. Dates, amounts, transfers. The evidence was not a theory. It was accounting. It demanded explanation. They confronted the mothers with the quiet violence of someone who has been lied to by those they trusted most. "Why didn't you tell us?" Isabel asked Kate with a voice that held accusation and bewilderment. "You told me you financed my tuition," Kate said, faltering. Her excuse fell like a house of cards. Emma, faced by Rio's ledger, stammered explanations about financial strain and bad decisions. Their justifications were small and ugly when placed beside Kimberly's careful payments. The confrontation cracked more than just explanations. It cracked alliances. Isabel accused Kate of stealing credit for kindness that was never hers, a performance where gratitude was redirected into leverage. Rio felt betrayed by the performative virtue of his mother and angry that the work of his grandparents had been hidden for convenience. The grandchildren's disappointment was a wedge that drove them toward truth. They turned to me. There was a tenderness in their questioning that made grief feel less lonely. I explained slowly. Kimberly believed in quiet stewardship. She thought the children would fare better without knowing the precise arc of her generosity. But she also warned me about predators. I showed them the trust language and Kimberly's handwritten notes about stewardship. Their reactions were not immediate forgiveness. They were critical, sober, and searching. Isabel's decision was swift once she had time to consider. She would not be party to deceit. "If you hide generosity, you steal legacy," she told her mother. "I don't want to be raised by illusions." Rio, who had always loved order and rule, took the ledger as a manual for justice. He wanted to learn law to defend families like theirs from exploitation. The grandchildren's focus shifted from inheritance to responsibility. Outside, the neighborhood watched these domestic eruptions with the polite voyeurism small towns supply. Friends of Kate and Emma called in alarm. "They're being dramatic," one said. "It's a generational misunderstanding," another insisted. But for Isabel and Rio, the issue was not generational. It was moral clarity. The truth had stripped away comfortable narratives. Kate attempted to appeal. She spoke of sacrifices and hard choices, of the difficulties of single parenting and marriage strains. Emma offered therapy sessions and a plan to repay funds. Their words flailed against the ledger's plainness. Apologies appeared in public, but restitution requires action, not just sound. The grandchildren's choice changed the calculus. With Isabel and Rio asking for clarity and accountability, the daughters could no longer wear public smiles to mask private strategies without consequences. Isabel demanded access to records and a say in the house's future. Rio insisted on a legal education route that distanced him from quick fixes and toward structural answers. Their decisions did not instantly heal the family. There were long silences and strained phone calls. Kate called, voice raw, asking if reconciliation was possible. Emma wrote a letter promising therapy and change. I listened, the ache fresh but purposeful. I had Kimberly's map, Isabel and Rio's resolve, and a legal posture that made predation harder. After the confrontations, they demanded to know what Kimberly had arranged. I told them enough. She had prepared a place and resources for their education and safety. They began immediate, practical steps: checking passport requirements, researching universities abroad, and contacting advisors. They wanted distance to think without manipulation. Their decision to step away felt like both rebellion and rescue. It altered the family's map and set a new direction we would all have to follow. New choices began. After Isabel and Rio decided they needed distance and clarity, I sat them down and opened the lockbox. The flash drive had been there, where Kimberly had left it, and now it opened like a small key to the life she had planned. We read her letter together and watched the documents unfold: a villa deed in Reykjavik, trustee agreements, an education endowment, and instructions addressed to Diego Amarim, Kimberly's chosen agent. Diego was no romantic courier. He was a professional with a steady hand. His correspondence was punctilious. Dates, bank routing, trustee names. Kimberly's trust was not a whimsical promise. It was a scaffold, legal architecture laid down so children could build without the threat of predation. In her letter she wrote, "Guard the children and teach them stewardship." The language was both tender and strategic. Isabel and Rio listened, then asked the questions that mattered most. Can we go? Is the villa safe? What will it mean for school? I answered them in pieces, honest and measured. I told them of Diego's reputation, of the Iceland trustees, of Kimberly's insistence on education rather than ostentation. I explained the trust terms, how the villa served as sanctuary and study, and how funds were earmarked for scholarships and internships. We made practical moves. Bar coordinated a discreet contact with Diego and requested an initial outline for residency options and school placements. The reply was efficient. Meetings could be arranged, documents authenticated, and accommodations prepared. Diego also confirmed that Kimberly had established an endowment specifically for Isabel and Rio's education and that the villa was set up to host interns and scholars. Part sanctuary, part learning hub. The decision to leave was not a flight. It was a considered step. Isabel packed a small bag. Books, a journal, a photo of Kimberly on the piano. Rio collected transcripts and began organizing his study notes. We applied for emergency consultations with admissions offices and passport services. Threads of bureaucracy bent to the urgency of those who meant to be deliberate. When the day came and we landed under Icelandic light, Diego was there in a dark coat and a quiet smile. The villa revealed itself as understated and precise. Stone walls, wide windows, a neat garden and a study designed for long nights of reading. Diego greeted us like someone introduced by a mutual respect. "Ms. Kimberly left everything in order," he said. "She wanted you to have a place to learn and to heal." The villa was more than architecture. It was Kimberly's philosophy incarnate. There was a small library of books she had curated. Titles on psychology, law, and literature. A modest fund to support internships, and a ledger of contacts for mentorship opportunities. Diego explained the trustee structure. Reykjavik professionals oversaw the accounts, ensuring funds would be used for education and stewardship rather than immediate consumption. Isabel and Rio found themselves absorbed into the rhythm of the place. Isabel spent mornings in the library, reading about memory and trust, while Rio conversed with a local law student about protective statutes and family trust models. They enrolled in preparatory courses and began internships arranged by Diego. The villa was not an escape from pain. It was a classroom for resilience. Diego then showed us additional files: an irrevocable Icelandic trust, clauses preventing sale, trustee names, and a Reykjavik law firm ready to authenticate documents. Bar coordinated cross-border counsel to ensure smooth legal recognition. Passports moved quickly. Admission interviews were scheduled. The relief that followed was private. Tears for Kimberly, gratitude for her foresight, and a steady commitment to steward the legacy. That night, sitting by a window that looked out onto a gray sea, Isabel and Rio talked openly about law and psychology, about what they wanted to study and how they would repay a legacy with service. In those conversations, Kimberly's plan began to do more than protect. It began to educate. The villa's walls, once mere property, became a quiet school for the next generation to learn how to build legacies that endure. The villa kept secrets like a patient housekeeper. Quietly, methodically, with economy of emotion. We had arrived under a pale sky, and Diego led us through rooms that smelled faintly of sea and new wood. He carried a leather folder heavier than its size suggested. "There are more things your wife arranged than you've seen," he said. His voice was even the kind that made important facts sound ordinary. Diego unveiled ledgers and correspondence Kimberly had left with him. Beyond the deed and the trustee agreement, there were accounts earmarked for internships, small grants for community projects, and an education endowment linked to specific universities. Kimberly had not only purchased a sanctuary, she had curated a curriculum. She had arranged mentorships with Reykjavik scholars and partnerships with a law clinic and a mental health collective. The villa was a house and a scholarship rolled into one. He pointed to a sealed envelope addressed to Isabel and Rio. "She asked me to deliver this when you settled," Diego said. The grandchildren opened their letters with hands that shook in different ways. Isabel's fingers quick, Rio's deliberate. Kimberly's handwriting was steady and direct. Advice on financial stewardship, recommended reading lists, a note encouraging humility, and a final practical instruction. Find a mentor, and when you do, cultivate them like a garden. Diego explained legal mechanisms with precision. The trust contained a clause that required trustees to approve disbursements for education and for projects that reflected stewardship and service rather than consumption. There was a contingency. If the Memphis property was threatened by sale or encumbrance, certain Icelandic accounts would be frozen and additional funds released to defend against legal actions. Kimberly had built gates and locks into the very architecture of her generosity. Beyond finances, Diego showed us correspondence with a Reykjavik law firm that outlined cross-border enforcement strategies. Kimberly had anticipated attempts to bypass local law by bringing suits in Tennessee. She had arranged for simultaneous filings in Iceland and had created an administrative pathway that made legal extraction slow and costly. In short, she had made aggressive moves and profitable and messy. Isabel's eyes narrowed at the section detailing mentorships. "She wanted us to do something with what we're given," she said. "Not just take it." Rio found a list of recommended journals and professors he'd soon meet. There was a small scholarship named for Kimberly that funded summer internships in social justice organizations. Money for work, not for luxury. Diego also produced a video Kimberly had recorded. In it she spoke directly. "If you find these words, then the storms have come. Use the house to learn. Use the money to build. Remember that guardianship is a word for vultures. Teach your children the difference between taking and stewarding." Her voice was both fierce and tender, and it folded the room into a silence that felt like a gentle command. The grandchildren responded to the villa as if it were a living syllabus. Isabel wanted to start a community workshop on memory and trauma. Rio began drafting plans for legal clinics that could help families secure estates from predatory relatives. The villa's resources matched their ambitions. Funds for pilot programs, a modest stipend for research assistants, and an administrative contact at the Reykjavik University willing to host visiting students. As we explored, a local reporter asked for a feature. I said no. Kimberly had not built this to be a headline. Diego understood privacy. He had facilitated discreet introductions with scholars rather than press. The villa was meant to be a slow garden, not a public display. In the evenings, we spoke with Diego about the trustees' obligations. The Iceland trustees were not family friends pronouncing blessings. They were professionals who would ensure the trust's clauses were respected. That structure, Diego said, would prevent impulsive sales or loans against the property. Kimberly had chosen jurisdiction for that reason. Icelandic trust law favored long-term stewardship and required a degree of transparency that worked in favor of preservation. The villa revealed a final, small measure. Kimberly had prepared an oral history project, a file of recorded memories she asked Isabel and Rio to continue. It was not a ledger or deed but a request to document family truth. "Your story is part of the defense," Diego said. "Memory can hold people accountable in ways ledger cannot." By the time we left, the villa felt less like a refuge and more like a mission. Kimberly had not sought to erase obligations. She had designed an educational ecosystem that would turn a potential inheritance into a responsibility. The grandchildren were no longer just potential beneficiaries. They were apprentices in the art of stewardship. The villa's secrets were not about hiding money. They were about building a culture that would resist greed. Back in Memphis, the house echoed differently. The legal pushback had rattled a few cages, but adrenaline and habit prompt second acts. Kate and Emma found themselves pressed from unexpected directions. Public scrutiny, strained partners, and the slow erosion of allies. Their first tactic after the retreat was public reconciliation. Kate posted a long statement about grief and mistakes, words polished by a PR consultant, while Emma appeared in a short taped interview about growth and mental health. The optics were intended to reshape the narrative. People are sometimes willing to forgive when performative humility is convincing. But the ledger tells its own story. Isabel and Rio had not kept silence. They spoke to friends and neighbors, told what they had found in Kimberly's files, and the local community began to ask uncomfortable questions. Those stories spread beyond the cul-de-sac. A local finance blogger tracked transfers and posted a thread. An old acquaintance noted inconsistencies in public claims about tuition payments. The daughters' polished images started to break like glass under precise hits. Kate's relationship with her partner frayed. He had been a quiet encourager of swift solutions and found himself named in conversations that suggested pressure to liquidate. His calls turned scarce. Emma's husband, Daniel, became a ring of worry around her. His temper sizzled where patience once lived. Partners who had been feeders for an impatient plan turned into mirrors that reflected consequences. Money made enemies visible. Creditors contacted Kate about an old loan that had been deferred. Emma found tax documents with overdue notices she had ignored. These were not sudden disasters. They were accumulated neglect. As debts surfaced and social capital eroded, their ability to marshal legal muscle diminished. Lawyers demand fees and reputations. Without both, options narrow. They sought therapy publicly, which bought sympathetic headlines but did nothing to fix legal constraints. A televised apology segment replaced the front-page rumors for a week. Then sales of sympathy soured into skepticism when records contradicted claims. The daughters tried to frame themselves as recovering villains. But accountability requires more than images. They tried litigation again, this time a guardianship petition. But the dossier Barr and I compiled made the petition thin. The judge demanded clear medical evidence and reliable testimony that I lacked capacity. Our affidavits, bank statements, and witness letters made short work of the petition. The attempt collapsed, and the daughter's attorney advised a pause. Another withdrawal followed. The social fallout snaked into family ties. Siblings of Kate and Emma, cousins and remote relations, began to choose sides. Some issued statements defending their right to care for an elderly parent. Others admonished their behavior privately. The family dinners that used to be routine hardened into cautious conversations and sometimes silence. One evening, a friend of Kate's who once cheered her on reached out and asked, "Do you ever think about how we wanted to show up differently?" Her email read like regret. Kate replied with a raw note that admitted mistakes but asked for time. Time was not indefinite. Reputations were thin. There were financial maneuvers too. A buyer who had once spoken to Kate about an Airbnb plan withdrew when public scrutiny intensified. Contractors who had quoted renovation figures pulled out. The markets that once flirted with the mansion decided the risk-reward was off. In short, the daughter's network decayed under the pressure of exposure. Yet the collapse was not solely punitive. There were moments of sorrow and insight. Kate sat in a therapist's office and listened to her own script of entitlement. She cried not just for public loss but for the rupture from her children, especially Isabel. Emma, in a rare late-night conversation with Daniel, admitted fear at her own actions. Therapy peeled a layer. Whether the change would hold was a different question. They began to write apologies, letters that listed small restitution steps. They volunteered at community centers, attempted to repair relationships, and reached out to creditors. These were acts that suggested remorse. But remorse without structural change reads as incomplete. The town watched, the legal filings persisted, and the situation settled into a new shape. Diminished plans and a slow, uncertain route to repair. Meanwhile, Isabel and Rio kept building in Iceland. The grandchildren's public statements about stewardship and truth carried weight. Their voices turned suspicion into facts in the court of local opinion. The daughters found themselves gasping in an environment where their narratives no longer controlled the flow of information. As months passed, Kate's social calendar shrank. Emma's podcasts about self-help lost listeners who preferred transparency to orchestrated healing. The sisters learned a hard lesson. Power consumed without ethics erodes the very foundations it stands upon. Their fall from momentum did not feel like vengeance. It felt like consequence. Jason, once the quiet middle child, testified on my behalf in a deposition, surprising many relatives. Placing a home into a conservation trust is an act of stubborn love. It turns market logic into guardianship. After months of preparation, Barr and I finalized the conservation trust for the Memphis mansion. The document was deliberate. The house would remain a family homestead, preserved for Isabel and Rio when they reached 30, and managed by trustees committed to stewardship rather than profit. The trust contained clear terms: no sale without unanimous trustee approval, distributions tied to educational projects, and a clause requiring beneficiaries to undergo financial stewardship training. Barr argued we had to tie values to access, and Kimberly's notes had insisted upon just such measures. Legacy isn't just ownership, he said. It's instruction. We filed the trust documents in county court and with Reykjavik trustees for cross-border recognition. The filing made selling the property legally onerous. Any attempt to liquidate the house would now require multiple jurisdictions' approvals and a demonstration that such a sale served the beneficiary's best interests, an intentionally high bar. The reaction in Memphis varied. Some neighbors applauded the preservation, sending notes that cited Kimberly's quiet generosity. Others, tired of drama, simply watched. The daughters reacted with the mixture of indignation and resignation they'd shown before, public remorse mixed with private scheming. That mixture began to thin when banks and contractors saw the legal bar and backed away. The trust had changed the calculus. Isabel and Rio sent a restrained message from Iceland, gratitude and a promise to steward. They wrote about plans to use the house for summer fellowships and reparative community work. They wanted the mansion to be alive with service, not empty as a monument. In their letters they asked for a guided stewardship, programs, mentorships, and community partnerships that could animate the home as a place of learning and reunion, not an asset to trade. Barr arranged the initial trustee board carefully. He nominated 2 trusted local professionals, an urban planner who valued heritage and a financial manager with a track record of ethical investments, alongside an Icelandic trustee representing the Reykjavik firm. The board was empowered to review uses of the property and to approve projects aligned with Kimberly's vision. The cross-cultural board would ensure the trust respected both local sentiment and international enforcement. We held a small ceremony to mark the trust's filing. It was not publicity theater. It was a measured acknowledgement. Isabel and Rio joined via video from the villa, and the lawyer read a concise statement about preservation. We planted a small tree in the garden, a symbolic act Kimberly would have liked. The press covered the filing in a few local outlets. Most of it was quiet and factual. Securing the trust did not erase wounds. Conversations with Kate and Emma continued in clipped tones. They sent letters asking for mediation and expressing intent to change. I listened and replied with guarded language. Reconciliation is possible when accountability is proven, not merely promised. The trust was not a punishment. It was protection for the grandchildren and a statement that legacy requires preparation. The trust funded educational programs Kimberly specified. We established a modest fellowship for undergraduate work aligned with community service and law clinics. The funds had conditions. Proposals needed to demonstrate tangible community impact and sustainable thinking. It was a design to encourage responsible stewardship rather than transactional use of resources. The trustee board began to receive proposals, from local historians requesting residency to community nonprofits asking to host restorative gatherings. Each proposal underwent scrutiny to ensure it matched Kimberly's clauses. Some requests were approved. Others were redirected toward partnerships that better fit the trust's mission. The house began a slow transformation from contested asset to cultivated commons. During trustee meetings, I felt a curious peace. Quietly content. Kimberly's handwriting had become law, and law had translated into practice. The house no longer dangled as a temptation. It became, slowly, a project with purpose. Isabel and Rio were mapped into its future through scholarships and fellowships that connected their education to real work. The trustees' deliberations were sober and protective. They measured each request with the long view Kimberly had demanded. There was one final clause that had a moral weight. The trust required beneficiaries to engage in a restorative process with estranged relatives before major decisions could be made. Kimberly believed in reconciliation, but she wanted informed reconciliation. Mature, accountable, and demonstrated. That stipulation forced us to build processes for repair that went beyond apologies. In time, the trust quieted the scramble. Kate and Emma's options narrowed as legal and communal barriers constrained impulsive moves. The house, once at risk of becoming a commodity, settled into a role as a protected site of memory and learning. Kimberly's design attained an effect she had hoped for, turning a possible sale into an opportunity to teach custody of memory across generations. The phone call arrived like an avalanche. Slow, then impossible to stop. It was Emma, voice thin, asking if I would come home. Her words pooled with late-night regret. "Dad," she said, "we're trying. The therapy is helping. Please come back. The house is empty without you." I listened to her rehearsed cadence and heard the old cadence of fear beneath it. Kate spoke afterward, voice breaking as if she had been made small by her own choices. They offered caregivers, a manager, and promises to focus on community programs, not profit. Each proposal had been shaped in a room where guilt met strategy. I found no triumph in their pleas. Forgiveness is not automatic. It is earned through action. Kimberly had built structures that required demonstration of change. A few apologies would not untie the legal knots or restore trust. I had seen apologies before that dissolved with the next convenience. That evening I walked to the villa's wide window and watched a sky the color of old pewter. Isabel sat nearby sketching plans for a community workshop. Rio read at a desk, absorbed in a treatise on trust law. Their focus steadied me. I could come back, I told them, thinking out loud more than promising. But returning is a different thing than trusting. I told them about the trust's clauses and how Kimberly had wanted stewardship, not spectacle. I reminded them that legacy required both humility and training. My daughters wanted immediacy. Kimberly wanted matureness. The villa was a long game, education, apprenticeship, and measured responsibility. If they meant to change, I wanted proof. Sustained community involvement, financial transparency, and time spent in restorative practice. Kimberly had asked that any major decision be preceded by documented steps toward repair. They listened with grief's fierce caution. I could hear want in Emma's pleas and raggedness in Kate's voice. Earnestness without structure is fragile. I suggested a path. Supervised restorative sessions, 6 months of open accounting, and a restitution plan for trustee review. Emma agreed to start therapy, to share financial documents voluntarily. Kate promised to join community work and to submit to mediation processes. They wrote a schedule, and I filed it with Barr for oversight. Their words began to move from apology to process. During the weeks that followed, I allowed supervised visits home. We walked the garden together. The scar of betrayal still itched, but small acts began to accrue. Still, the call one morning changed the shape of decision when Emma rang again, this time quieter and more urgent. "Dad," she said, "the bank froze my accounts. We can't manage. Please, I'm scared." I sat in the villa study with Kimberly's letter on the desk as wind moved outside. I understood fear. I had faced it on many nights patrolling neighborhoods. But I also knew how fear could be converted into corrosive impetus. The trust was meant to blunt the rush to sell and to force deliberation. I told Emma what I had told her before. I already packed long ago, but I never left. The line was not a taunt. It was a translation of a choice Kimberly had given me. Freedom without abandonment. I had legal means to protect the house and moral clarity to refuse to sell our shared memory. Emma's sobs on the other end were a sound I recognized from 1,000 small tragedies. She begged for leniency and for help. I offered support, guidance in negotiating with banks, referrals to financial counselors, and mediation arranged through Barr. I did not offer a surrender. The trust permitted assistance that did not dismantle its protective barriers. I employed those provisions. In time, their therapy progressed. They volunteered, took accounting classes, and attended mediation. The public statements became less theatrical and more practical. They set up repayment plans and community scholarships. The moves were slow and intrusive to pride, but the point was not spectacle, it was restoration. I watched their small changes with the guarded hope of a man who had loved and been betrayed. Reconciliation, Kimberly had written, required both accountability and time. We arranged a formal restorative process mediated by community elders and legal advisors. The sessions were uncomfortable but sincere. The meetings were long, and the agreements were detailed. By the time Isabel and Rio finished initial internships, family edges softened. Kate and Emma were not absolved, but they were in a process that might, over years, reconstruct trust. I remained in Iceland much of the time, returning occasionally to assist with trustee meetings and community events. The separation had become a discipline, an enforced space in which change could be practiced rather than promised. Occasionally I flew back for trustee meetings, neighborhood gatherings, and to sit with neighbors who remembered Kimberly's kindness. Small rituals that stitched the community back toward trust again. The last secret sat folded in a folder the color of old paper, and sometimes I wondered whether secrets age like wine or sour like fruit. Months had passed since the villa welcomed us, and daily life had formed a new rhythm. Trustees issuing reports, the grandchildren running fellowships, and small reconciliations occurring under careful supervision. Memphis adjusted. Kate and Emma did some good work, volunteering, attending mediation, and making modest restitution. They had not been absolved. Change had a slow accounting. Neighbors watched, some forgiving, some reserving judgment. The trust had made impulsive sale legally difficult, converting a potential windfall into a long-term project that resisted quick extraction. But Kimberly's flash drive still held material I had not released. Sealed directives and contingency files labeled for emergencies. There were clear instructions for the grandchildren at 30, counseling notes, and a dossier meant for what Kimberly called last resort use. Her language was precise. Exposure only if harm was imminent, otherwise steward and teach. I told Isabel and Rio there were sealed matters but withheld details. They accepted the restraint. Isabel, who had become blunt in her convictions, said, "We want to build, not to hunt." Rio, studying law, prioritized structural remedies over theatrical exposure. Their restraint felt like proof that Kimberly's plan worked beyond finances. It shaped character. Occasionally we opened other, lesser files, a list of recommended readings, contacts for internships, and small grants for pilot projects. Those documents transformed the villa into a living curriculum. Diego kept in touch with practical updates. The Reykjavik trustees sent quarterly letters that described disbursements and approved fellowships. The villa became a place where scholarship met service. One afternoon an anonymous letter arrived in Memphis with 3 simple words, names left unsaid. It felt like a reminder more than a threat. I handed it to Barr and we discussed whether disclosure served justice or only wounded. We chose the former, restraint unless a purpose demanded otherwise. Kimberly had prepared power. She had also prepared principle. The grandchildren expanded programming, a summer legal clinic, a community memory project, and a small fellowship on stewardship that invited local students. The house's rooms filled with teaching, debate, and repair. Kimberly's intent translated into public good rather than private spectacle. The house grounded a campus of small acts that nudged a community toward repair. At times I worried about morality becoming menu, picking spectacles that looked like reform but were shallow. So I insisted that proposed projects submit concrete plans showing measurable benefit over time. We tied grants to outcomes and mentorship to measurable stewardship goals. It was not punitive. It was provident. Kimberly's notes had described stewardship as sustained work, and we enforced that discipline. A few years in, Isabel and Rio requested access to a portion of Kimberly's sealed materials as part of a maturity review. The trustees convened and found them ready. They read the letters set aside for them, advice, histories, and a modest list of accounts revealing Kimberly's quiet generosity. The documents were not vindictive. They were instructive. Isabel wept at a passage about memory. Rio read a clause that explained why Kimberly had chosen Iceland's jurisdiction. Meanwhile, Kate and Emma's lives had altered. They worked in clinics, paid down debts, and participated in restorative projects at the mansion. Their public personas never regained the ease they once had, but some small reconciliation emerged. It was not clean nor complete, but it was real in parts. I often sat in the villa's study and read Kimberly's letters. In one she wrote, "If they come hungry for what is not rightfully theirs, feed them truth. If truth fails, feed yourself dignity." The sentence stayed with me. I had used discretion and law instead of spectacle, and I believed Kimberly would approve. On the eve of a quiet anniversary, years since Kimberly's death, the trustees held a modest reception celebrating the trust's first fellows. Isabel spoke eloquently about responsibility. Rio announced a partnership with a law clinic. The house hummed with a different music than it once had. It harmonized memory and work. That night I unlocked the drawer and placed the drive back where Kimberly had left it. The sealed directives remained sealed by design. I recognized the power of keeping options. Power without purpose risks corrosion, Kimberly had implied. Power with principle protects. I had packed long before the world demanded it. That packing had not been an escape but a choice, to conserve the heart of our life and to refuse to convert it into a transaction. In those final quiet hours, I felt less like a man who had won a legal fight and more like a guardian of a promise. I need you to hear me, not just the man who packed a suitcase, but the husband who learned the cost of silence, and the father who had to choose between comfort and truth. Tell me this. When someone you love betrays you, what does justice look like? Is it forgiveness, accountability, distance, or something else entirely? When a family member turns a legacy into a ledger, who protects the memory? And who has the right to decide what a legacy means? I want to know what love means to you after pain. How do we teach the next generation to steward what matters? Money, yes, but also memory, dignity, and trust. And finally, when you think of legacy, do you see an inheritance or an obligation? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Where are you watching from? Tell me your take. Would you have done what I did, or would you have chosen differently? Be honest. Your perspective matters more than applause. If this story moved you, share it with someone who loves complicated family stories. I'll be reading the comments, and I'll reply to as many as I can.